It is great to be here at Vanguard, to be back at Vanguard. I am a fan of this organization, this group, the Global Center for Women and Justice. I'm also particularly glad to be here in my new role as the United States Ambassador to monitor and combat trafficking in persons. I haven't been doing it very long. I was confirmed by the Senate in late October and get to step into this new role. I was telling some friends that going through the process of Senate confirmation was a little bit like doing the lab portion of an AP government class. Learned so much. I'm a big fan of the State Department's Trafficking in Persons Office for a long time, and now it's an incredible honor to get to serve alongside these dedicated professionals. But I have to tell you, more than anything, it just confuses people. I can't tell you how many times I get questions about what exactly is an ambassador at large? And what does the State Department have to do with trafficking in persons? And so this morning, what I'd love to do is answer those two questions, but also share with you what I see as a current trend that impacts the topic of your conference. So let me start with this. Let me start with, what is an ambassador at large? Most people, when they hear the word ambassador, if they used to live in India, they think of a car, if any of you guys have visited. But other people will think of someone who goes to another country. Those are ambassadors in residence. They're ambassadors to a specific place on a wide variety of topics. An ambassador at large is an ambassador not to one specific place, but to all places, but on one specific topic. The United States government has 6 ambassadors at large, and I am so encouraged that our government in 2000 decided that trafficking in persons was an issue that was worthy of this level of attention. I'm the 6th person that gets to sit in my seat to hold this job. I've gotten to meet all 5 other ambassadors, and am so grateful for their encouragement and support during this process. So that's what an ambassador at large is. What about the State Department itself? When we think about trafficking in persons, we think about prosecutors or law enforcement or social workers or nurses or other individuals that are providing care. What they do seems to be obvious, like we get it. It's intuitive. But when we think about diplomats, we wonder, what exactly do they do? You know, I think I can shed some light on this, even though I've only been in my role for a little over 4 months. The office at the State Department has 3 core mandates. The first is that we engage the globe. That is, we get to go out and work with countries around the world on how can they enforce their laws to protect people. How can they recognize the dignity of every individual who might be exploited by a trafficker? We also get to engage in domestic coordination. That is, we support the coordination of the interagency work domestically in the United States. And then third, we advocate for robust engagement and partnerships with governments, international organizations, civil society, faith communities, and survivors of human trafficking, each of whom are doing unique and important work to help others. So let me suggest that we think of these individually. When we think of global engagement, we work with governments around the world to improve their specific policies and laws to stop traffickers, protect victims, and change systems that benefit and enable traffickers to thrive. And we have several tools to do this. The first is our annual Trafficking in Persons report. This comes out each June. There's several copies in the back, and you can download it online if you like as well. But in this, we go through each P of the 3 P paradigms, that is prosecution, protection, and prevention, and analyze what each country is doing regarding each of these, providing a trafficking profile of what trafficking looks like in that country, as well as specific recommendations and a roadmap of how to improve, what could be done. Uniquely, we also do this for ourselves. We put together a narrative for the United States, which is somewhat self-critical, but also outlining a path for where we have room to improve. Another significant tool that we enjoy is foreign assistance. We get to put out grant programs all over the world, bilaterally with other governments, but also funding civil society in those countries to help governments bring the promise of freedom to their citizens. We do technical assistance and training, where we go out and assist individuals and police officers, law enforcement, and others to make sure that their laws are compliant and they know how to help. Perhaps the most important tool is honestly our people. The professionals that serve in the Trafficking in Persons office are utterly impressive. They are dedicated, they work tirelessly, and the quality of their work is only surpassed by their professionalism and commitment to this mission. In 2018, this small team spanned out to cover almost 100 countries on 6 continents to engage foreign leaders on this critical topic. Because there is no substitute for physical presence. Honestly, just showing up sometimes is its own action-forcing event. It allows us to better understand what's going on, to build context, and it allows us to ground truth claims and come up with recommendations in the Trafficking in Persons report that can actually improve the efforts in that country. So in addition to our global engagement, executing U.S. foreign policy and the importance of ending human trafficking, we also work domestically. We work with the interagency groups, so the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, Health and Human Services, all these groups. There are several mechanisms that are there to support this. One is the President's Interagency Task Force on Trafficking in Persons, which is a cabinet-level gathering where each secretary from each of the agencies comes together to discuss what their agency is doing to combat trafficking in persons. And this past President's Interagency Task Force meeting was actually chaired by the President himself. In addition to that, we have the Senior Policy Operating Group, which I get to chair, where the same agencies come together at a slightly lower level, my level, and we get to talk about what we're doing in each agency. How do we collaborate? How do we deconflict? How do we do better? The Senior Policy Operating Group has several committees that works to raise awareness, to understand vulnerable communities, and to make sure that we are moving forward. Notably, we also get to have the U.S. presidentially appointed Advisory Council on Human Trafficking. Congress created this in 2015, and it's a huge step forward. The idea that survivor voices matter. These individuals gather not to tell their stories, but instead to give advice about specific policies, specific improvement, using their expert experience in what has happened to them to influence what we need to do as a government. Survivors should have a voice at the table in shaping policy, and we are grateful that they do. You know, the third mandate of our office is to engage the public and build partnerships. The office works with leaders, experts, and everyday citizens across public and private sectors to leverage experience, think about innovation, find resources, and further the momentum that is necessary to combat this crime. And as we head into 2020, which I will let you know is going to be the 20th anniversary of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and the 20th anniversary of the United Nations Protocol against trafficking in persons. And we are already whiteboarding, we're already brainstorming for a celebration that will not just capture the successes and the best practices and some of the failures that we've learned from over the last 20 years in this journey, but pivot towards what do we need to do in the future? What do we need to do in this next 20 years as a movement to make sure that we can bring the promise of freedom to everyone? Excited about this 20th anniversary and invite you to be a part of that as we form these plans. You know, as we go forward, I want to be clear on the interagency piece that we do this work not to have meetings. We collaborate, but collaboration is not the goal. It's a tactic to achieve the goal. Whenever someone tells me that we need to collaborate more, I'm always asking myself, to do what? Because nobody needs more busyness masquerading as progress. We actually need things that are going to have an impact, things that are measurable, things that are going to do something meaningful. Because I think the millions of victims around the world today are not in desperate need of more good intentions. They're not calling out for us to wear the right colored awareness ribbon on the designated awareness day. I mean, don't get me wrong. I wear the ribbons, and I like the awareness days. Join me in them. And raising awareness is important, but I think there has to be more. I think we have to actually get things done. We need to work together in effective partnerships in order to accomplish specific goals. Now, to that end, let me turn to a trend that I've noticed in our movement. A few years ago, I actually shared this trend with Dr. Morgan, and like a wise professor, she pointed me to a few resources, suggested I need to read, and she helped me focus my thinking. It all started my freshman year in college. I thought I was a good student. I had a research paper to write, and I thought it was absolutely fantastic. I was so excited to turn it in because I was already preemptively enjoying my professor's response. I knew once he read this, he would be thinking, prodigy, I've been waiting for this student my entire career. But instead, when I went to his office to pick up my paper, scrawled across the title page was this: banish the passive voice forever. Amen. And I read this and was completely dumbfounded because I had no idea what the passive voice was, right? In my county, nobody taught grammar growing up. I had no idea. So I trotted my way down to the writing center on our campus in search of help. It appears that this is a massive, massive problem. I learned, because you all already know this, that the passive voice is basically a sentence that hides the actor in a sentence. I live in Washington, D.C. We're really good at the passive voice, right? Mistakes were made, right? No one identifies who made the mistakes. We just know that they happened. Words were spoken. The anti-trafficking world is saturated with passive voice language, and it always aids the traffickers. Here are some common statements about human trafficking that I found on the internet from different organizations. Individuals are trafficked in both formal and informal sectors. Millions of victims are trapped in modern slavery. The scourge of human trafficking affects millions. Now, each of these statements fail to name the actor. They conceal the individual who caused the trafficking crime to occur. You see, by using the passive voice or by personifying the crime as the actor, we omit the trafficker entirely from the sentence. And in these constructions, human trafficking becomes a non-sentient scourge or a mindless epidemic that sweeps across our land with all the intentionality of a weather pattern. And the truth is, human trafficking is not a natural disaster. Human trafficking is not a naturally occurring phenomenon. We are not powerless to avoid it. The women and the men who exploit others for profit are the ones who are committing this crime. Simply put, human trafficking doesn't exploit people, traffickers do. Now, when I looked to our colleagues in the domestic violence movement, I learned very quickly that they have been dealing with this same problem, but far earlier. They're much more mature in their perspective about this. Using a pie chart, they sought to identify the root causes of rape, just as a thought exercise. They provided options like wearing suggestive clothes, the overconsumption of alcohol. They thought about flirty behavior or women walking alone at night, or the media's objectification of women or rapists. And so the question to all these students was, what are the causes of rape? And as you might imagine, and many of you have seen these exact circles before, this pie chart is solid. The root cause, the only cause of rape, are rapists. Likewise, if we ask what are the root causes of human trafficking, we can list all sorts of things. The lack of education, Poverty, the push and pull factors of migration, job opportunities, immigration status, traffickers. And what would that circle look like? What would that pie chart look like? I think it would also be solid that the root cause of trafficking is indeed traffickers. Now, I know that rape and human trafficking are different crimes. They're differently motivated sometimes. I'm not attempting to draw an equivalency, but I do think the analogy is useful in clarifying this point. So at the encouragement of Dr. Morgan, I turned to some other researchers, to scholars like Julia Penelope, Alexandra Fraser, and Jackson Katz, who have noted the impact of trafficking or of passive voice in the conversation about domestic violence. Here's what their research showed. When they went through all this literature, they found a progression, a pattern in the way people talked about domestic violence. It started with this. It started with the idea that Jack beat Jane. There we go. Jack beat Jane. A sentence that identifies who the actor is, the verb, beat, right? And then who was beaten? Jane. Jack beat Jane. A really clear sentence. The second progression ended up being Jane was beaten by Jack. Jack has moved to the end of the sentence, and the focus becomes on Jane. The third progression deletes Jack entirely, and now it's Jane was beaten. He's erased from the entire discussion. And then in the fourth turn, the most troubling turn, what Jack did shifts not to something that happened to Jane, but becomes an identity statement about her. And now it is Jane is a battered woman. Putting the focus on Jane, whether intentionally or not, we engage in victim blaming. We end up asking questions like, why did Jane stay? Why didn't she leave? What was she thinking? In human trafficking, the progression is very similar. It's Jack forced Jane to work. Jane was forced to work by Jack. Jane was forced to work. Jane is a human trafficking victim. By removing the named agent who elects to commit the crime of human trafficking, our focus shifts from the cause of the offense to the effects of the offense. And let's be clear, this is the exact opposite of what we talk about when we talk about a victim-centered approach. You know, we would not entertain this same pattern in other areas of crime. We would never say bank robberies torment federal depositors. We would never say murder affects thousands of people each year, or fraud strikes again, stealing from the vulnerable. Like, we just wouldn't do it. But in areas where we're talking about sexual offenses or offenses against women, somehow we end up in a passive voice conversation. And I think it's time to stop. You know, this is not mere semantics. This is not just grammatical preferences. There are real-world consequences to this passive approach when we talk about combating modern slavery. First, think about this. Deleting the trafficker inhibits criminal or civil accountability. The global prosecution of traffickers is shockingly low. The 2018 Trafficking in Persons report revealed that governments convicted 7,045 individuals. That's a 22% decrease from the prior year. Considering the International Labor Organization's estimate of 24.9 million victims in the world, we realize that traffickers are operating with impunity. We must put the trafficker back into the sentence if we are ever going to hold the traffickers accountable. Erasing the trafficker from the sentence, deleting them from the conversation, also harms our protection and prevention efforts, because ultimately it imputes the trafficker's agency to the victims. In a pimp-directed sex trafficking case, it leads people to make statements like, "She went back into the life." It drives me crazy when I hear people say that. Because what they should be saying, if she's a trafficking victim, is that the trafficker recruited her back in, tricked her back in, coerced her back in. It's not her choice to go back in. And of course, the life is just a creative way in the lingo of the traffickers that I see no reason for us to adopt. Another impact of this passive approach is that it causes people of goodwill to lose hope. I think well-intentioned people are willing to draw near to pain if they think they can do something about it. But if we think it's some unavoidable plague or some disembodied menace, many people just feel overwhelmed and powerless, when in reality the truth is there are practical things that we can do to stop traffickers, protect victims, and enhance our prevention efforts. By maintaining our focus on the traffickers, we allow a victim-centered, trauma-informed approach to flourish. I think it's just time to put the trafficker back into the sentence, which is particularly important when I think about the topic of this two-day conference. Because you all have given yourself a very challenging goal. What do you do when the trafficker is the mother? What do you do when the trafficker is a parent, a sister, a sibling? What do you do when they're the spouse, the aunt, or the uncle? What do you do when home isn't safe because the trafficker lives there? You guys are addressing a sensitive issue, and it's heart-wrenching. It's a situation where many people are just stunned to learn that family members traffic other family members, which is remarkable because we know that familial connections have never been a way to inoculate any type of crime. According to the Human Trafficking Institute, which I have to confess was my former employer, so take this with a grain of salt, 14.4% of all the federal human trafficking cases in 2017 involved a defendant who forced their children, spouse, intimate partner, siblings, or other family members to work or engage in commercial sex acts. This happens. And it's not just numbers and statistics. They are real people behind these numbers. I thought I should introduce you to a few of these traffickers. Home was not safe in Charlie Bett's house. It wasn't safe for his daughter. Charlie's daughter was 15 years old when her dad started smoking cocaine with her. It started several times a week. And once she was high, he began to sexually assault her, to abuse her. Then Betts recruited his 12-year-old niece, his daughter's cousin, provided her with cocaine and began to engage in sex acts with both children at the same time, sometimes using force, sometimes using restraints. Clark Betts did not limit his criminal activity to incest, rape of children, or drug-related offenses. He soon turned to brokering the two children to his drug dealer and to others. He would allow others to engage in sex acts with these two children for him to receive back things of value, like additional drugs. A federal jury in Iowa convicted Clark Wesley Betts Jr. of 2 counts of sex trafficking of children, and the court sentenced him to 40 years in prison. And home was not safe. It's not just sex trafficking cases. Obviously, we want to focus on all forms of trafficking, and that includes labor trafficking. Home was not safe for Antonio Marco Diego's sister and her 9-year-old niece. Antonia invited her sister to come live with them in Olympia, Washington. Antonia coordinated a coyote who helped smuggle them into the United States and arranged for their transportation to Washington State. Once there, they lived together in Antonia's home. And during the day, Antonia forced her sister and niece to work in agriculture. Antonia's coercive scheme included confiscating their identity documents, the exploitation of their immigration status, exorbitant charges for rent, for food, and for anything they could find. Finally, Diego's sister escaped. She ran away, and a good Samaritan found her walking in a ditch along the side of the road, and he called 911, and help was on the way. Antonia and her husband both pled guilty to forced labor in federal court in Seattle, Washington. Antonia got 1 year probation, and her husband got 18 months. Concerningly low. The court fortunately did order some restitution, $10,600, because home was not safe. And it's not just sex trafficking and labor trafficking in the United States, it's also globally. It's a global phenomenon. Home was not safe for a 7-year-old boy in Ghana. His mother sent him to work with a fisherman to support the family. The boy did not want to go, but felt he had no choice. The fisherman forced the boy to live with him and to work. They fished for 4 years with no pay to the boy. Eventually, the mother tried to get him back, but the fisherman refused. When she died, the local community and the Child Protection Committee threatened to report the case to police if the fisherman did not return the boy. And so the fisherman said, "Fine, I'll return him." Sent the boy to live with his grandparents, where his grandfather forced him to work under even more brutal and harsh conditions. That home wasn't safe either. Eventually, the community appealed and the grandfather finally released the boy to an NGO and a shelter program. Today, he has new goals, and he wants to be an engineer. Police have now arrested the grandfather and the fisherman. These examples illustrate that when home isn't safe, when traffickers are exploiting people that they have a familial relationship to, it creates incredible challenges, whether it's for prosecution, protection, or prevention. Just consider how difficult victim identification is made when there's a familial relationship. Parents appropriately have a great deal of authority over their children. If someone sees a stranger with similar authority, they might report the case. But the fact that a parent has authority over their child doesn't raise anyone's eyebrows. It's not out of the ordinary. It's just easier to hide parental abuse. In family-directed trafficking situations, much of the trafficker's coercion occurs behind closed doors, in the family's residence and out of view of the public. Such victims also have emotional bonds that run far deeper than the bonds that a victim might have with a trafficker to whom he or she is not related. And protection efforts are made more difficult. Typically, social workers would consider returning a victim to their family. If it's a loving and supportive home, it is one option. When home isn't safe, traffickers remove that as an option, and shelters and foster care become even more important. Trauma-informed counseling is made more challenging by a familial relationship. Survivors not only have to deal with the trauma they endured, but also face the sense of betrayal, dealing with the idea that the people who were charged to love them the most are the ones that betrayed them and exploited them. And traffickers evade prosecution when they choose to exploit family members. Evidence is always more challenging in human trafficking cases, but it's even more difficult in family-directed trafficking, where witnesses are even more reluctant to come forward and corroboration is harder to develop. Criminals who make their targets of their illegal activity their own family members are intentionally doing so to make it difficult. Education and awareness programs often warn people about the typical schemes that traffickers use, but they rarely highlight family-directed trafficking. And so you all, in this difficult task, are bringing attention to when home is not safe, and you're putting traffickers back into the sentence when they're family members. You're not allowing others to erase these perpetrators from the conversation. And the success you have in combating family-directed trafficking can assist us in engaging other nations to improve their efforts to help victims when home isn't safe. The combined experience and talent and resources in this room is impressive. And so I want to invite you into partnership with the State Department's Trafficking in Persons Office. The Trafficking in Persons report not only assesses foreign governments, but it also includes a narrative about our own country. The office recognizes your expertise and knows that you are on the front lines. You see firsthand which practices are working, which ones are not, and where there are gaps. So we welcome you to contribute information about what you see on the ground to the narrative of the United States in the Trafficking in Persons report. I would love for you all to contribute information. You can do so in a couple of ways. You can send emails to tipreport@state.gov or tipreportus@state.gov and submit your information. Help us do better so that we can help other governments do better. Let me close, though, with an argument for hope that's steeped in history. I'd love for you all to know that human trafficking has existed for almost all 4,000 years of recorded history in some form on every continent. Greeks and Romans, Aztecs and Mayans. It's been something that has been democratically approved and enshrined in our own Constitution in 3 places. Slavery has been with us. It's been legally protected, democratically approved, religiously endorsed, and culturally accepted until about 220 years ago. Think about that. There's this grand international consensus of trafficking for 4,000 years, and then in the last 220 years, something has changed. We have now seen, one by one, every country outlaw the slave trade and begin to pass laws against trafficking in persons. We have seen religious leaders of every major religion stand up and say, our sacred texts do not endorse human trafficking. For the first time in history, we have a grand consensus. Never before have we had so much information about how traffickers operate around the world and how their crimes affect individuals and communities. I want you to know, I think this is a massive historic hinge. And I believe the door of freedom is poised to swing wide. The question for our generation is, are we going to be the ones who bring that hope of freedom into reality? Are we going to be the ones who bring those parchment protections of law down to the individuals that they were intended to protect? I think there is a great deal of hope because we actually can make a difference in ending trafficking. We have to do it together. It will be hard. It will take a lot of time. There are no silver bullets. If there were, we'd already fired them. Instead, it's just the long, consistent perseverance that will make the difference. And I'm grateful that I get to be here with you in that fight. So thank you very much.